All right, before I introduce today's speaker, our speaker next week will be John Hubers, and his topic is an introduction to the Christians of the Middle East, perceptions and sometimes deadly misperceptions. So very timely, and I just feel like we are so lucky in this congregation to have such a wealth of resources within our congregation and our community that we draw from, and then the missionaries that we've been able to pull into as they've been home. So we're really blessed with that. And I don't know if there's anybody in this room who doesn't know Jeff Monroe, but I have a couple of things by way of introduction, because I knew we often do have new class members that may not know Jeff. Jeff is the former regional director of Young Life. You may not know that he spent 30 years with Young Life and then became the executive vice president at Western Theological Seminary and retired from there. He is an author. He's recently an active book editor. He is the editor of the Reformed Journal. And a third member, obviously. And technically, I guess he's my boss, because I'm the volunteer treasurer of the Reformed Journal, and Jeff is my superior who gives me my my direction. So, Jeff, we're just lucky that you are home from your travels. He's been traveling around to many places, U.S. and Canada, and talking about his book, and now he's going to kind of give us a review of this past year.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you for coming. I didn't know if anybody would come, so I'm kind of amazed by that. Well, the truth of the matter is we had somebody else that was going to do the class this morning, and then about 2 weeks ago, he's an older gentleman, and he said, I've got some health issues. So, Lori, I had to tell Lori that we didn't have somebody to do the class, and I've always learned if you're going to present somebody with a problem, it's always great to present them with a solution at the same time. So I said, well, I was working on a piece for the Reformed Journal right then on what I'd learned in the last year since my book came out. And I said, that will be, it was exactly a year ago this Saturday that we did the launch party here on a kind of nice January day, a very rare occurrence this year, but last year it wasn't so bad. And then a year ago in this room, on this Sunday morning, Dan Rooks and I did a little introduction to the book. And so I thought I would expand on what have I learned, what do I wish I had known, and I did bring a couple, I should take these out. I did bring a few copies with me just in case there's anyone in this church who doesn't have one, which I think is a rare thing. But so it's Telling Stories in the Dark. And I actually also brought my credit card reader with me this morning, just saying. I'm full service. And Gretchen accepts Venmo. So, and it's $20, better price than you can get on Amazon. But that's the end of my sales pitch. So Dan Rooks has a lot to do with messing with my mind seriously about this, because he has said to me since, I interviewed him, he's in one of the chapters of the book, but he has said to me constantly, some version of, well, there's a thing that we say as we write, if you ever write poetry, that they say that the poem is always smarter than the poet. The poem knows things, that things get expressed somehow that the poet doesn't even know. And so he has said that to me often about this book. He's like, there's a lot to this book that you don't understand. And he's actually right. There's more, he says, you're tapping into things that are more powerful than you realize. And I think that's true. And so I've tried to understand what those are. What I have felt over the course of the year is that oftentimes I just need to get out of the way and let things happen with the book and the response to it. So I'm going to try to explain some of that. I also need to explain myself because as Lori mentioned, I've been everywhere but here for the last year. We really haven't been here very many Sundays. A couple of times Ryan has told me that they talked about sending elders over for a visit to see. But I've been at churches in Illinois and Iowa and Minnesota and Ontario and Massachusetts, and a bunch of different places in Michigan. I've been on Zoom with a church in California, and on Zoom with a group of therapists and pastoral counselors in Albany, New York. I received a note saying my book was being used in a women's prison in Anchorage, Alaska. And I know it was used for a class at the Hanlon Correctional Facility in Ionia as part of the Calvin Prison Initiative. I even was a guest, this might be the highlight, I was a guest on a podcast called The Beached White Male. I'll just let you guys absorb that title. Think about what that might mean. And in April, I'm going to be on a podcast called The Happiness Journey with Dr. Drew. Yeah. I've taught at HASP. I've taught at Call, which is Calvin's version of HASP. And then on Wednesday, I start 5 weeks on Wednesday, 5 Wednesday nights at the Second Christian Reformed Church in Grand Haven, where their church is reading the book, going to read the book. And there's a church in Hudsonville right now that I launched doing that, and they're smarter than they've got a team of therapists that are taking weeks, and they're doing 5 weeks with it, but I'm not involved. And that's what, when I say, Dan Rook said, get out of the way, that's what I feel like. Well, they're doing the right thing. So what have I learned? That's what I want to talk about. And I called this Sacred Holy Moments because these have been, for me, sacred holy moments. So you'd think that since I wrote a book about stories, I would appreciate how important stories are, but I'm reminded of this constantly. So at the beginning of January, I preached at this church that's reading my book in Hudsonville, and a woman came up to me after the service, and this has happened repeatedly. And she asked me if I knew a certain person, and I didn't recognize the name. And then she said, well, that person's wife and daughter were killed in an automobile accident several years ago. And I thought, oh, that's a horrible thing. And then she said, I caused the accident. And I look at people when they tell me something like that, and I just wonder, how do you go on? How have you put your life together? So I was back at that church the following Wednesday, and the woman was there, and she handed me a folder, and she said, I want you to have this. And I opened it up, and it's the title on it says, My Story. And there were 5 or 6 or 7 pages typed out detailing the accident and then everything that had happened since. But what I saw was it was much more than her story. And let me see if I can, if this makes sense. It was how I've put this together. Theologically, intellectually, philosophically, morally, ethically, all those things. I'm trying to figure out why this horrible thing has happened or make some sense out of something that is nonsensical. How do I make sense out of something that doesn't make sense? And that experience has been one that I've had often of people coming up and telling me their stories in that way. For example, at another church, a woman came up to me after I'd done a class, and started telling me about her journey with breast cancer. And, it was a kind of a typical cancer story of, this is how close I came to dying, and then I didn't die, and I recovered. And then, though, she said, the week I went into remission, my 18-year-old son went out and laid down on the railroad tracks and took his own life. And again, it's like, oh my gosh. So people carry so much stuff with them, and we really don't know what kinds of things people carry with them. So I saw this, this was on the day after Christmas, actually. A friend of mine sent this to me from an article that was in the New York Times Magazine, and it was a story about a woman who had written her story, and then all the comments and emails that she'd been getting of other people telling her their story, very similar to the experience that I've had. And she went to a trauma therapist to try to help her understand this. And here's what the trauma therapist said: being human is being storied. Our identities are built on the stories told about us and that we tell about ourselves. Healing comes from sharing our stories. We need our stories to be witnessed in order to heal. And that's the thing one of the things that I look at now and say, I wish I'd understood that more powerfully. People have asked me, well, where does listening fit in? And I've said, well, listening is very important, but I should have hit that more in this book, that it's not just telling our stories, it's that someone listens to our stories is where healing begins to happen for us. And I was reading a book last night where I read a line in it that I thought, oh, this works well with this class. It was about a doctor, or the scene was about a doctor and about his patients, and how this endless stream of people coming set in Ireland in a small town, and all these people coming in to share their complaints with the doctor. But the author said the doctor knew the truth that all doctors know. I'm looking at you, Steve Orlow, to see if you'll agree with me. Yeah. That simply telling the symptoms is the beginning of healing. That somebody listening to me, listening to my story, listening to what has happened is so important. And so I was in Ontario, and a man came up to me after I had presented in the evening. That was at a Christian Reformed church, and being Christian Reformed, I preached in the morning, but then they had to come back on Sunday night, right? And we did a second thing on Sunday night. But a man came up who was, I would say, 80 years old, and said, I think I should tell you something I've never told anybody before. And he said, I don't know if I should tell it to you or not. I said, I think you should. Go ahead and tell me. And he said, when I was 12, our family moved from the Netherlands here to Ontario. When I was 14, my father was killed in an automobile accident. After the accident, my mother forbade us from speaking his name and talking about it. And his eyes welled up, and I was like, oh my gosh. That he just carried this with him. And what we need to heal is to actually tell about these things and have somebody listen to them. So Dan Rooks, Dan Rooks writes me I published this story in the Reformed Journal. He writes me 3 emails with long things connected to each. I wish he was here so I could pick on him even more than I am already. But every time I do something like that, it spurs more thoughts. But this is one of the things that he shared with me. And actually, somebody else told me about this during this year also. So I figure if it's coming from 2 sources, it's interesting. And it's this ancient Jewish practice. So this is from a rabbi that tells us that in the Mishnah, which is this ancient rabbinic text that is a couple thousand years old, that comments on the law. They tell the story, of what would happen when the people used to go to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Thousands of people coming at once on a kind of sacred pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They would ascend the steps to the Temple Mount, and then they would go through this arched entryway, and they would turn to the right, and they would circle around the perimeter of the courtyard, and then they would exit pretty much where they had come in. Except the Mishnah says for someone who is brokenhearted, that person would go to Jerusalem. They would ascend the steps. They would walk through the arched entryway, but they would turn to the left. And so every single person that was coming from the right would pass the people that were coming from the left. And they would ask the simple question, Malach, what happened to you? And the person would stop and would say, I'm brokenhearted. My loved one has died. I'm worried sick about my kid. I've got a lump that I don't understand. And the people who are walking from right to left would have to stop and offer a blessing before they could continue on their pilgrimage. And then this rabbi said, I just think how profound the insight is in this ancient ritual, because if you spend your whole life dreaming of going up on this sacred pilgrimage to the holiest site, the holiest place on the holiest day, and doing your circle around the courtyard, the last thing in the world you want to do is stop and ask the poor guy who's coming towards you, are you okay? What's going on with you? What's your story? And yet central to your religious obligation, in fact, the only religious obligation you have on that day is precisely to see this other person in their suffering and ask them what their story is and then give them a blessing. And if you're broken, shattered, the last thing you want to do is show up in this space with all these people and go against the current and in such a public and visible way. And yet you're obligated to do that. And so I think the rabbi has kind of captured this very sacred and profound psychological, spiritual tool, which is to say when we're suffering and when we're hurting, we need to be seen by other people. We need somebody to say, tell me about your pain. Help me understand what's going on for you. We need to be blessed. That's why the loneliness, this is a commentary on today, of this moment feels so profound for many Jews, talking about with isolation, a little bit of Israel with the problems in Gaza. Because we feel like, we often ask people, tell me about your pain, tell me about your suffering. How can I be a good ally? How can I stand with you in solidarity? But why isn't anyone asking us? It's a reminder for us that we have to reinforce our commitment to living in a world in which we can see each other in pain. And when we're walking from right to left because we're okay that day, we don't turn our eyes away and our hearts away from the poor person who's walking toward us who's not broken that day. Otherwise, our humanity is lost. Isn't that powerful? Yeah. So thanks, Dan. So that would be the first big takeaway for me. I wish I'd emphasize more how important it is not just that we share our stories, but that we share our stories with a compassionate listener, compassionate witness to the story. The second thing I want to share is actually something that I couldn't put into the book because you guys back there, this is like, get ready. Because it's audio visual. But I did a class a couple weeks ago where I was asked back to a place that I'd already been. And so then it's like, so I have kind of a dog and pony show like worked out. This is the introduction to the whole thing. But then if they ask me back a second time, then I actually have to like come up with something. So I had this idea that I would ask Suzanne McDonald to come with me. And we would just talk about dementia together, because I have a chapter in the book that's about dementia. She has done incredible study and has done many, many different presentations on dementia. And she shared 2 songs as part of that. And I wish I could have put them into my book somehow. So I just want to share these with you. The first one is by Glenn Campbell. Glenn Campbell, you probably are aware, died of Alzheimer's disease a couple years ago. This is the last song he recorded. It's while he had Alzheimer's. So one of the amazing things about Alzheimer's is that you don't know who your family is, but you still know music in many cases. That's a different sort of memory. And so he could still play the guitar. He could still sing. He didn't know what he was singing. He didn't know what he was playing. And so this is a song that he did that's kind of a retrospective on his career and his life at the same time, but it's called I'm Not Gonna Miss You. I'm not gonna miss you because I don't know. It's just very powerful. So.
I'm still here, but yet I'm gone. I don't play guitar or sing my song. It never defined who I am. The man that loved you till the end. You're the last person I will love. You're the last face I will recall. And best of all, I'm not gonna miss you. I'm not gonna miss you. Say I love you to kill. You're never gonna see it in my eyes. It's not gonna hurt me when you cry. I'm never gonna know what you go through. Not gonna miss you. I'm not gonna miss you.
I wrote a poem that I put in the book about So my mom, the story is that my mom died of Alzheimer's, and one of the things I did was included this poem that I'd written about that experience in the book, which I'm going to share. This poem is called Memory. I could handle the questions repeated endlessly like we were in Groundhog Day. Who are you? Where do you live now? When did you become my son? You told me a man had been kind enough to give you a room in his house. And when I said that man was your husband, you laughed and laughed. You kept your good nature and smile as your world was reduced, first to the apartment, then a room, then just a chair. In a rare moment of clarity, you looked around and said, so this is the way it's going to be. No, it wasn't. It got worse. Confusion yielded to terror. Words became moans. Your head was a weight too heavy to bear. Your skin was on fire. Your muscles rigid. Your eyes endlessly searched for something, anything familiar. You forgot to eat, then breathe. There was no point to any of this. You just suffered for senseless days, weeks, months. Who are you, I wondered. Where do you live now? When did you become my mother? Like an overdue guest, death finally arrived, and at your funeral, people said the images of suffering would fade, and I would be left with positive memories. But what I'm left with, besides the god-awful fear that this will someday happen to me, is the sight of you slumped in that wheelchair, incoherent, uncomprehending. My mother, yet not my mother in any way I want to believe. You couldn't remember? I can't forget. What is memory, anyway? A blessing? A curse? So I have one more song that Suzanne shared. This one we just listened to. We don't watch, but I just think this is outstanding, wonderfully done, and very clear, easy to understand the lyrics.
She softly walks into his room, sits down and says hello. He says, you look familiar. Are you someone I should know? I got this funny feeling we've met somewhere before. There was a fleeting memory as you came in through the door. She smiled and said, my darling, well, you're looking mighty fine. In fact, we've known each other since 1949. Had a lifetime of memories, but there's nothing left to show. When her mind and her body choose a different time to go. She's a stranger in his mind. The memories are gone, but his heart's still keeping time. The cruelest fate for all the loved ones left behind. And how can life be so unkind? She's a stranger in his mind. She tells him stories of the man he used to be, all about his children and his loving family. She pleads, can you remember? Then gently takes his hand. He says, I wish I'd known him. He sounds like a good man. He said, well, thanks for coming. Will I see you again? She says, I'll be back tomorrow. So I'll see you then. Every day they spend together is a blessing and a curse. but she's faithful to their wedding vows, for better or for worse. Kneeling by her bedside, the tears pour down like rain. She prays that tomorrow he'll remember her name. She's a stranger in his mind. The memories are gone, but his heart's still keeping time. We'll say a prayer for all the loved ones left behind. This happened life be so unkind. She's a stranger in his mind. She's a stranger in his mind. She softly walks into his room, sits down and says hello.
So I wish that I had been able to say clearer something actually that I read by Peter Marty in the Christian Century last month in his letter that he publishes at the front of it, which was about sometimes that the thing we need to do is to break our promises. And the reason that he wrote that was, he said, one of the primary things that I deal with as a pastor are people coming to me about their loved one and saying, I promised I would take care of him, and I can't take care of him anymore. And they feel trapped by the promise that they've made, or sometimes feel trapped by the wedding vows that they've made. And yet there comes a point, oftentimes, when you can't provide the kind of level of care that needs to be provided. And I wish I'd said that more clearer. And I wish I had dealt. I think I have a good chapter on dementia. I wish I'd fully grasped or fully articulated or fully said just how difficult it is for families, and how I just have heard from over and over again from people who are dealing with it. And like I got a text message last night from a woman whose husband has Alzheimer's, and she's trying to figure out what to do. One other thing that's actually, this was part of writing the book when I was doing it, was one of the people I profiled really early that several of you know is a guy named Roger Nelson. Roger Nelson's that story that I have. His father was murdered in Roger's presence when we were in seminary together. I know Bill and Nella that you worked with, Ron, Roger's dad. But right before I was going to work on this, and a few months before I was going to interview Roger to tell that story, Roger was out riding his bike and was hit by a 17-year-old driving with a learner's permit and almost killed, and went through an ordeal and a half. And I then had a decision to make. Was, I wanted to tell the story about his dad, but this other story was overwhelming also. And I made the decision I wasn't going to tell that second story because I wanted just to focus on the first. But I feel like I left something out by not telling that second story. And then Roger wrote something in the Reformed Journal that we published right before the end of 2024. And I want to read a little bit of this for you also, and then make a couple comments about it. The name of the article was Lucky. On a bluebird morning in July of 2021, I went for a bike ride, training for my 6th Ironman. Those are the triathlons. I rode thinking about the gift and fizz of athletic accomplishment. With the wind at my back and the sun on my face, I turned toward home, grateful for the beauty of this good earth and a hearty dose of endorphins. A 17-year-old boy driving a Chevy ran a red light and broadsided me. I have no idea how fast he was driving. I was probably doing 22 miles an hour. The wind was at my back. The police report put my body 50 feet from the point of impact. The collision exploded my lower leg, severed an artery, blew out my ACL, fractured my femur, separated my pelvis, broke a rack of ribs, collapsed a lung, scarred my heart, and damaged the cranial nerves that sync up eyesight. Unconscious and bleeding on the side of the road, I don't remember anything about the crash. The next few days and weeks are blurry fragments and impressions. I had 5 surgeries in the first 11 days. So some of my confusion was the result of anesthesia and pain medication. The rest was brain trauma, body trauma, and trauma. The afternoon of the crash, they operated to save my leg. The next morning, my wife Sandy says that the first thing I asked the doctor was, when would I be able to run again? I was talking, but I was confused. I was bedbound, I was paranoid, and I was delusional. A week later, the first conscious reflective thought that surfaced was, I am diminished. The visits of family and friends are foggy, but I remember thinking that physically, mentally, and emotionally, I was diminished. I wasn't the person that I remembered. I couldn't think clearly. I wept easily. The healthy athlete that was in my early 60s, the healthy athlete that I was in my early 60s was gone and somehow diminished, pushed through the fog. When life is measured by accomplishment, even how many miles one runs, rides, or swims, it's disorienting to lose the ability to accomplish anything. Any sense of achievement, desirability, identity, or independence was stripped away. I wasn't fit. I was broken. I wasn't a leader. I was lost. I wasn't gifted. I was diminished. And a friend framed it this way: when your identity is tied up in being an athlete and being a preacher, writer, and both are taken away, at least for a time, you're stripped down to what matters. What's exposed is your vanity. What matters is your family. Every one of us will eventually be diminished. Aging will erode what we can accomplish. Sickness or disease will shrink what we're able to do. We'll try to negotiate, manage, and exercise control. At our best, we'll adapt to those losses while holding on to memories and gratitude. But I wasn't ready. I still felt vibrant. I was still hopeful. I still had things to accomplish. I still thought what I did mattered, or at least it gave me a sense of purpose and personhood. However, while I was diminished, I wasn't dead. I was close, but I was lucky. The car was small. I was taken to a good trauma hospital. My helmet worked. Help responded quickly to stop the bleeding. My family was by my side. I guess that's luck or providence or evidence of a benevolent God. 3 years later, I'm present as a husband, father, grandfather, and friend. I'm back at work. I can swim, ride, walk, and go to the gym. A pacemaker, defibrillator offers some protection. That's my new normal. And outside of a clumsy little limp and a scar that looks like a big shark bite, and it does, and I've been with him, we've been in warm places together, and he is asked daily when he's wearing shorts, did a shark get you? Because there's this big piece of his leg that's not there. There's no external evidence of the accident. Again, thanks to luck, access to the best of modern healthcare and God's merciful hand. God's hand. What of God's hand? What about God in all of this? In the quiet of a hospital room in the middle of the night when fear was real, I prayed simple prayers. God, help. God, thank you. That was all I could muster. I didn't have a unique experience of God's peace. I didn't turn to scripture. I didn't recite hymn lyrics. I didn't hear God's voice. All I could come up with were those deep longings. Help. Thank you. I experienced the presence of God in people. As I recovered, I was buoyed by their visits, calls, texts, and stacks of cards. God's love and family, friend, and church community broke through the concussive drug fog. They were visible expressions of an invisible God. I was embarrassed by the attention, but I'll be forever grateful for a host of loving and supportive friends. One of those friends, a retired pastor, came to see me and brought a passage printed on a 3x5 card. We taped it to the hospital bed and tried to keep it in mind. It read, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you." I'm thankful for those words and that faith tradition. That said, most of the time I felt like I was sinking. I didn't exude confidence or traffic in optimism. I was weary, worried, and pain was grinding me down. There were a few weeks in the hospital and a couple months of recovery at home. After the skin graft, I was supposed to be immobile. As those days blurred together, my mind was mush. My will was flaccid, and I was exhausted with myself. I often got stuck in my head and didn't say much while I wanted to be buoyant. The waters were sweeping over me. There's more. You can find it on the Reformed Journal where he talks a little bit about his wife as well. But I'm struck with, I think what Roger is doing is actually telling his story, but also telling how he's trying to make sense of his story. This horrible thing has happened. I'm trying to make sense of it. So one of the other thing I think about with my book is maybe I'll do another one where I just write all these stories that people keep handing me and say, these are the other stories. You know, I do have a friend that I'm going out with lunch with this week who immediately when this book was published said to me, why am I not in there? People have stuff, you know. So maybe I'll do Roger 2.0. One last story, and then I'm going to read one last thing, and then we can talk for a minute. But the other wish I had was I wish that this book had been published while it went before this book, because I would have drawn from this book in this book. This is a book called Living with Grief by Nick Walterstorff. It came out a couple months ago, and we read it. Sunrise Saints read it together. I interviewed Nick. He's in this book, and much of the stuff he says here made it in here. But he talked about grief subsiding writes about grief subsiding in a very powerful way in here. And I want to just read this paragraph, 2 paragraphs, and then tell you one more story about someone in this church who's not here. I'm looking around for him, but you'll figure out who it is, even though I'm not going to say his name out loud. But let me just read this first about grief subsiding. Grief, I have said, subsides. Though it cannot be relieved or alleviated, it does subside. The way to alleviate grief over the death of a loved one would be to bring the loved one back to life, and that's impossible. Sometimes a person in grief learns that she was mistaken in believing that the one she loved was lost. Then the grief vanishes. It does not get alleviated, it disappears. The attention of the griever can be drawn to other things, but that too does not alleviate the grief. It just distracts the griever. But grief does subside slowly over time. It subsides mostly, I think, because one learns to live around the gap. One has no choice. One lives one's life differently, reorders one's way of investing oneself in the world. For a long time, one continues to want to talk with the person one loved and still loves. But there's nothing one can do to satisfy that desire. No way to embed it within one's ongoing plans. It's irrelevant to one's plans. The result is that slowly the desire becomes less intense, less preoccupying. Nothing reinforces it. The same irrationality of grief And he calls grief irrational because it's wanting what you cannot have. It's wanting that person to be returned to you. The same irrationality of grief that at first makes grief so agonizing leads eventually to its subsiding. One notices after a while that one is no longer in grief. Though it flares up without notice, one is no longer grieving. But life is not the same. And so the story I want to tell is that we read this together in Sunrise Saints, and we did that. We started in January a year ago, so it was very early. It's one of my first experience. It was my first experience with a group going through this and talking with them about it. And I remember asking the question, has anyone in this group wondered why, ever asked the question why something terrible had happened? And one of our group members, and this is what I'm saying, I'm not going to tell you his name, but you'll all figure out who this is, who's in his 90s, immediately responded and said, yes, when I was a boy, I wanted more than anything to have a little brother. And then my mom got pregnant, and it was a boy. I had a little brother. And then when he was about 10 months old, he died. And he said, I can remember driving, and he pointed in this direction, and he said, I could take you there right now. I don't remember what street he said, but we were going to the funeral at the First Christian Reformed Church of Zeeland. And I was in the car, in the back seat of the car, wailing, saying, why, God? Why has this happened? So we just listened to that for a moment. And then after a minute, I said, how long ago did this happen? And he did some mental math, and he said, 88 years. 88 years, and it was still so real to him. And so that's when I think of when grief subsides, but it never goes away. That it never goes away. 88 years. And then he said to us, I tried to talk about it once in this church, in this room, 30 years ago. And I couldn't even get words to talk about it then. So that's another, I wish I could have written that story in my book, but that story was caused by my book. But it's another thing I wish I'd have said more clearly about the nature of grief. I do say that it doesn't go away, but that sense of subsiding but not going away that I think Nick captures, I wish I'd had that. So those are things I think about. Those are some of the experiences that I've had. I felt like I should come and give a report of myself to restore myself into good membership of the church. Marcia, and Randy, who I usually sit between, both of them had put out an APB wondering where the heck we were. So do you all have any comments, questions, anything you want to ask about? We have a couple minutes still. Lori's got a microphone. She'd be happy to take anything. Anything strike you as true? Or things that you identify with? What did you identify with that I've shared today? Anyone? Elaine?
Yeah, I just identified with what you were just saying in that years ago, I can remember sitting down in the room in the basement at a class. It was a class on grief, and I think my sister-in-law was leading it. And she directed a question to me because she knew that when I was 16, my father died. And she asked me this question, and I just broke out and cried. I mean, here I was an adult, many, many, many years later. So it is very true that this kind of thing happens, and I certainly have experienced it.
Yeah. So they're triggers that happen to us that bring it back. Yeah, Beverly.
When the song by Glenn Campbell just made me think of a biking friend of mine. Her husband has Lewy body dementia and doesn't really remember who she is anymore. But she sent me a video just a couple of weeks ago of him singing a song. There was a young man with a guitar playing a song that he knew from when he was younger, and he was sitting there singing the song and could remember all the words, but couldn't remember her.
Yeah. The story I tell in my chapter is that of being with our mom, and this is after she didn't know who we were anymore. And I'd heard this, that Alzheimer's patients could remember songs sometimes. So I started singing Amazing Grace. And we had this very holy, sacred moment of singing Amazing Grace together. And when it ended, my brother, being my brother, said, "How about this one, Mom?" And said, "Moon River." And she started right in on Moon River because that was another one of her favorites. So it's not just the hymns that get remembered, it's music that gets remembered. Yeah.
It's true that grief doesn't go away, but I've found myself feeling grateful for that, because if it did go away, that means I forgot, and I don't want to forget.
Yeah. And that's what the get over it, that's one of the messages that we tell people that's a bad message. That means Nick says, he says, am I supposed to pretend my son didn't exist? Am I supposed to pretend this wound isn't real? Yeah, when I taught the class at HASP, I had at the end, we were processing together, and a woman said, my husband died 2 years ago, and my friends said, there are two things you need to know. Number one, nobody wants to hear you talk about it. And number two, you just need to get over it as soon as you can. And she was grateful for our class that gave her permission to feel and remember and say, and not pretend that wasn't real, but to live into her feelings. Yeah,
there are funny stories too with Alzheimer's. I can remember taking my teenage girls to visit with my mother at the home where she was, and the kids afterwards said to me, "Mom, how can you just go and talk psychobabble like that?" And I said, because you're not going to correct her, you're not going to set her on the right path, so you have to enter into the conversation, however crazy it is, and just enjoy those minutes.
Yeah.
And I can remember driving home thinking, when did she leave me?
Yeah. Yeah, I tell the story of with my mom of her saying on the phone to me one night, she said, she asked me the question, when did I become her son? And then she said, well, where do you live? And I said, I live in Michigan. And she, at this point in her life, the end of her life, she lived in California. And I said, I live in Michigan, where we lived most of our lives, and where you lived most of your life, where I've lived almost my entire life. And then she said, well, I live out here. A man has been kind enough to give me a room in his house. And I said, that man's your husband. And, oh, no, he's not. And I said, yes, he is your husband. And then I could hear her kind of put her hand over the phone and say, he says you're my husband. And from the other side of the room, I could hear, that's what I've been trying to tell you. But it just doesn't matter how many times you try to tell them something. It's not going to make a difference. Yeah. So that's a rich part of the discussion of how do we become, as Suzanne puts it, how do we become guardians of someone's personhood in the midst of that, to help them still be who they are, even when they've lost a memory in that way. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. I was like, I don't think anybody's going to show up, so I appreciate that. If anybody wants a book, I've still got some, so happy to do that. And God bless you all for being here. And can I say a prayer for us? Lord, for the depth of experience that we have as humans, we are both grateful, and yet at the same time, we just have questions, things that don't make sense. Help us be compassionate witnesses that listen well to each other, that even though we might be in a day where we make the right turn, know that others are making the left turn, and they need us to say, how is it with you? And help us be ones who care. Thank you for these good folks in this great church. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you
Jeff.
all. I'll see you. Thank you.